The year was 1448, and across the blood-soaked battlefields of Eastern Europe, a name began to emerge from the shadows that would make hardened warriors cross themselves in terror. While most 17-year-olds were learning to wield swords or manage estates, one young prince was already perfecting techniques of human suffering that would redefine cruelty itself. This wasn't just another medieval ruler claiming a throne through birthright or conquest. This was the beginning of something far more sinister. A reign that would transform punishment from simple justice into an elaborate theatre of agony. The man, who would become history's most innovative architect of terror, didn't start as a monster. He began as a political prisoner, a hostage held by the very empire he would later torment, with methods so horrific that even his captors would recoil in disgust. But somewhere in those formative years, watching the mechanisms of power and fear operate with surgical precision, a transformation occurred that would echo through centuries of nightmares and ultimately inspire literature's most famous vampire. What you're about to discover isn't a tale of supernatural horror, but something far more disturbing. The real story of a man whose calculated brutality made fiction seem tame by comparison. This is the true account of Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, whose surname Dracula meant son of the dragon, and whose methods would prove that human imagination, when applied to inflicting suffering, knows no bounds. The world that shaped this future master of terror was itself a crucible of violence and betrayal. 15th century Eastern Europe existed as a deadly chessboard where kingdoms rose and fell with each military campaign, where alliances shifted like morning mist, and where survival demanded not just courage, but the willingness to embrace methods that would horrify more civilized ages. Wallachia, the small principality caught between expanding empires, served as a buffer state whose rulers faced an impossible choice: submit to foreign domination or face annihilation. Into this volatile landscape stepped Vlad Dracula, father of the future Impaler, a man who understood that maintaining power required walking a razor's edge between competing forces. The Ottoman Empire pressed relentlessly from the south, their vast armies carrying the promise of both protection and enslavement. Hungary loomed to the north, offering Christian solidarity, but demanding absolute loyalty. Between these crushing forces, Wallachia's princes learned that neutrality was suicide, but choosing sides carried its own deadly consequences. Young Vlad's education in the arts of power began not in comfortable palaces, but in the gilded prison of the Ottoman court. At age 10, he and his younger brother Radu were handed over as hostages, human collateral to guarantee their father's loyalty to Sultan Murad II. This wasn't uncommon practice, but for most children, it meant a life of comfortable captivity, eventual conversion to Islam, and integration into the Ottoman elite. For Vlad, it became something entirely different. The Ottoman court was a masterclass in the exercise of absolute power, where the Sultan's word carried the force of divine law, and disobedience meant swift, spectacular punishment. Here, surrounded by the empire's most sophisticated administrators and military leaders, young Vlad observed how fear could be weaponized more effectively than any army. He watched public executions designed not merely to end lives, but to break the will of potential rebels through displays of overwhelming force and creative cruelty. But it wasn't just the mechanics of terror that the young prince absorbed. He learned to read the subtle dynamics of power, understanding how reputation could substitute for military strength, how the threat of extreme punishment could maintain order more efficiently than complex bureaucracies, and how the careful cultivation of a fearsome image could make actual violence less necessary by making potential opponents too terrified to act. The Ottoman education system for noble hostages included military training, administrative skills, and religious instruction intended to create loyal servants of the empire. Vlad excelled in all areas, demonstrating both intellectual brilliance and physical prowess that impressed his captors. Yet beneath this surface compliance, something darker was taking shape. Contemporary accounts suggest that even as a teenager, Vlad displayed an unusual fascination with the methods of execution and punishment employed by Ottoman justice, asking detailed questions about techniques and timing that disturbed even hardened officials. The relationship between the two brothers during their captivity reveals much about their developing personalities. Radu, younger and more adaptable, embraced Ottoman culture wholeheartedly, eventually converting to Islam and earning the nickname Radu the Beautiful for his charm and diplomatic skills. He would later serve the Ottoman Empire faithfully, becoming a trusted general and administrator. Vlad, by contrast, maintained an icy distance from his captors, fulfilling his obligations with mechanical precision while never showing genuine warmth or loyalty. This psychological armor that Vlad developed during his captivity would prove crucial to his later methods. He learned to compartmentalize emotion from action, to view human suffering as a tool rather than a tragedy, and to calculate the precise amount of cruelty necessary to achieve specific political objectives. The Ottomans had intended to create a loyal vassal, but instead they forged something far more dangerous, a student who would eventually surpass his teachers in the very arts they had taught him. News from Wallachia during these years of captivity painted an increasingly grim picture for the young hostages. Their father, Vlad Dracula, struggled to maintain his precarious position between competing empires while facing constant challenges from ambitious nobles within his own realm. The Wallachian aristocracy, known as boyars, played a deadly game of shifting loyalties, supporting whichever claimant to the throne seemed most likely to advance their personal interests while eliminating those who threatened their power. The political situation reached its crisis point in 1447 when a coalition of Hungarian-backed boyars assassinated Vlad Dracula, torturing him to death in what they claimed was justice for his Ottoman sympathies. His eldest son, Mircea, suffered an even worse fate, captured alive and tortured with hot iron stakes before being buried while still breathing. The brutality of these deaths, carried out by men who had once sworn loyalty to the Dracula family, would profoundly impact young Vlad's understanding of trust, loyalty, and the necessity of preemptive violence. When word reached the Ottoman court of these murders, Vlad's reaction was noted by several observers for its chilling calm. While his brother Radu wept openly for their father and brother, Vlad received the news with apparent indifference, asking only practical questions about the political implications and the identity of those responsible. Ottoman officials, expecting grief or rage from the 17-year-old prince, instead encountered something that made them deeply uncomfortable. A calculating intelligence that seemed to view even family tragedy as useful information rather than personal loss. The Sultan, recognizing an opportunity to install a compliant ruler in Wallachia, decided to back Vlad's claim to his father's throne. This support came with a price: absolute loyalty to the Ottoman Empire and the implementation of policies that would effectively make Wallachia a Turkish province. For most claimants, this would have been an acceptable bargain, trading some autonomy for the military support necessary to claim and hold power. Vlad agreed to the terms with the same mechanical precision he had shown throughout his captivity. But those who knew him best recognized that his compliance was purely tactical. The return to Wallachia in 1448 marked the beginning of what would become one of history's most innovative experiments in psychological warfare. Vlad's first reign lasted only 2 months before Hungarian forces drove him out, but even this brief period provided glimpses of what was to come. Several boyars who had participated in his father's murder were found impaled on wooden stakes, their bodies displayed prominently as warnings to others. The method was crude compared to what would develop later, but the message was clear: betrayal would be met with suffering that exceeded the crime. During his years in exile, plotting his return to power, Vlad refined his understanding of fear as a political weapon. He studied the methods employed by various rulers throughout history, from Roman emperors who used crucifixion as public theatre, to Byzantine generals who employed psychological warfare against their enemies. But more importantly, he he began developing his own innovations, techniques that would combine the efficiency of Ottoman administrative methods with a creativity for inflicting suffering that surpassed anything previously documented. The key insight that would define Vlad's later reign was the recognition that cruelty, to be truly effective, must be systematic rather than random. Arbitrary violence might terrorize individuals, but it could also inspire desperate resistance from those who had nothing left to lose. Calculated cruelty, precisely calibrated to serve specific political objectives, could achieve far more comprehensive control while actually requiring less overall violence. The threat of extreme punishment, properly cultivated and maintained, could eliminate the need for constant enforcement. When Vlad finally secured his throne permanently in 1456, he inherited a realm devastated by decades of civil war, foreign intervention, and aristocratic treachery. The boyars who had murdered his father remained in positions of power, confident that the young prince would need their support to maintain his rule. Foreign merchants operated with impunity, cheating local traders and evading taxes through corruption and intimidation. Ottoman administrators collected tribute with increasing demands, while Hungarian agents worked to undermine Wallachian independence from the north. Any conventional ruler would have faced years of careful political maneuvering, building alliances, making compromises, and gradually consolidating power through traditional diplomatic means. Vlad chose a different path entirely, one that would transform his realm into a laboratory for testing the limits of human endurance and the effectiveness of terror as a tool of governance. The methods he would employ over the next 6 years would establish his reputation throughout Europe and create a legend that would outlast his actual political achievements by centuries. But before we delve into the specific techniques that earned Vlad his terrible epithet, we must understand that what followed wasn't the product of madness or sadistic impulse. Every act of cruelty, every innovation in the infliction of suffering, every carefully staged display of power served calculated political objectives. The man who would become known as Vlad the Impaler was many things, but he was never insane. He was something far more terrifying, completely rational. The transformation from exiled prince to absolute ruler required more than political maneuvering or military conquest. It demanded a complete reimagining of how power could be exercised, maintained, and projected across both domestic and international spheres. What Vlad understood, with a clarity that eluded his contemporaries, was that traditional methods of governance had failed repeatedly in his homeland. Diplomacy had led to his father's assassination. Military strength alone had proven insufficient against larger empires. Compromise had resulted only in exploitation and eventual destruction. The solution he devised was elegantly simple in concept, yet revolutionary in its application. If conventional political tools were inadequate, then unconventional methods would be employed. If enemies could not be defeated through superior numbers or better tactics, then they would be neutralized through superior terror. If allies could not be trusted through bonds of loyalty or mutual benefit, then they would be controlled through absolute fear of the consequences of betrayal. The first test of this philosophy came during Easter of 1459, when Vlad extended invitations to the great boyar families of Targoviste for a feast of reconciliation. These were the same noble houses that had orchestrated his father's murder, the same aristocrats who had spent decades playing deadly games with Wallachian independence. Their acceptance of his invitation revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what their new prince had become during his years of exile and captivity. The feast itself was a masterpiece of deception, designed to lull the assembled nobles into a false sense of security while positioning them for what would follow. Vlad played the role of gracious host with consummate skill, speaking eloquently of forgiveness, unity, and the bright future that awaited Wallachia under their collective leadership. Wine flowed freely, conversations grew animated, and the atmosphere became genuinely festive as old enemies appeared to embrace genuine reconciliation. The signal, when it came, was subtle. a slight gesture from the prince that his guards had been trained to recognize. Within moments, the doors were barred. Armed soldiers surrounded the hall, and the nature of the gathering transformed completely. The elderly boyars, those most directly responsible for his father's death, were seized immediately and dragged from the hall while their families watched in growing horror. The younger nobles and their relatives were spared this immediate fate, but only because Vlad had different plans for their suffering. What followed was a systematic elimination of an entire generation of Wallachian aristocracy, carried out with a precision that spoke to months of careful planning. The elderly boyars were impaled that very evening, their stakes positioned where the sounds of their dying could be heard throughout the city. But this was merely the opening act of a much larger performance designed to reshape the fundamental power structure of the realm. The surviving nobles and their families were forced to march through mountain passes to the ruins of Castle Penari, where they would spend whatever remained of their lives constructing Vlad's new fortress. These men and women who had lived in luxury, who had commanded armies and controlled vast estates, found themselves reduced to manual laborers working under conditions that killed many within weeks. Their noble titles became cruel jokes as they hauled stones and mixed mortar while wearing the fine clothing they had donned for what they thought would be a celebration. The psychological impact of this mass elimination extended far beyond its immediate victims. Every surviving member of the Wallachian nobility understood that their world had changed forever, that the traditional protections of rank and birth no longer existed under their new ruler. The message was unmistakable and absolute. Cooperation would be rewarded with survival, resistance would be met with suffering that exceeded imagination, and neutrality was no longer an option. But Vlad's innovations extended beyond the mere elimination of political enemies. He recognized that lasting control required the creation of new systems that would maintain order without requiring his constant personal intervention. The impalement technique, which would become his signature method, was refined during this period into something approaching an art form, carefully designed to maximize both physical suffering and psychological impact on observers. The process began with the selection of stakes, which were deliberately fashioned to be blunt rather than sharp. A pointed stake would penetrate too quickly, causing death within hours and reducing the educational value of the display. Vlad's stakes were rounded and carefully smoothed, designed to enter the body slowly and avoid vital organs during the initial penetration. This allowed victims to remain conscious and aware for days, while suspended in agony that could be heard across great distances. The positioning of impaled victims became a calculated science, with different arrangements serving different purposes. Concentric circles around city centers created amphitheaters of suffering that forced all inhabitants to witness the consequences of disobedience. Linear arrangements along major roads served as warnings to travelers and foreign delegations. Geometric patterns visible from castle walls provided constant reminders to potential conspirators that their prince possessed both the will and the means to transform rebellion into public spectacle. The timing of these displays was equally strategic. Executions were scheduled to coincide with market days when crowds would be largest, with religious festivals when the moral implications would be most apparent, and with the arrival of foreign ambassadors who would carry reports of what they had witnessed back to their own courts. Every aspect of the process served multiple purposes: punishment of the guilty, deterrence of the contemplating similar actions, and advertisement of royal power to both domestic and international audiences. Vlad's methods attracted attention from across Europe, but not always the kind of attention that traditional rulers sought. Reports of his techniques reached courts in Hungary, Poland, and the German states, where they were received with a mixture of horror and fascination. Some viewed him as a useful ally whose reputation could serve their own strategic interests. Others saw him as a dangerous madman whose methods threatened the established order of Christian Europe. The Ottoman Empire, which had invested so much effort in shaping the young prince during his captivity, watched his transformation with growing unease. The compliant vassal they had expected to install in Wallachia had instead become something unprecedented, a ruler whose methods exceeded even Ottoman standards for creative brutality. Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople and architect of one of history's most successful military machines, began receiving reports that suggested his former hostage had surpassed his teachers in the very arts they had tried to instill. The economic impact of Vlad's reign was as dramatic as its political consequences. By eliminating corrupt merchants through spectacular public punishments, he temporarily reduced the graft that had been bleeding the realm dry for decades. By terrorizing potential rebels into absolute submission, he eliminated the costs associated with maintaining large standing armies or building extensive fortifications. Fear functioned as an invisible military force, patrolling borders and maintaining order without requiring payment or supplies. Trade, however, presented more complex challenges. While Vlad's methods eliminated many forms of corruption, they also created an atmosphere of uncertainty that made normal commercial relationships difficult to maintain. Foreign merchants approached Wallachian markets with extreme caution, aware that any perceived slight or business dispute might result in punishments that bore no relationship to the severity of the offense. This uncertainty, while reducing some forms of exploitation, also limited the economic growth that stable governance might have provided. The international diplomatic community struggled to develop appropriate protocols for dealing with a ruler whose methods violated virtually every accepted norm of civilized behavior. Traditional diplomatic immunity, which protected ambassadors even during times of war, seemed meaningless when dealing with someone who viewed the murder of envoys as a legitimate form of political communication. Courts across Europe began developing new procedures for their representatives, including explicit instructions about proper behavior and emergency protocols for situations where normal diplomatic protections might not apply. Religious authorities faced equally complex challenges in responding to Vlad's reign. While his methods were clearly incompatible with Christian teachings about mercy and forgiveness, his political position as a defender of Christian territory against Ottoman expansion complicated simple moral judgments. Some priests quietly supported his actions as necessary evils in the struggle against Islamic conquest. Others condemned him as a figure whose methods made him indistinguishable from the enemies he claimed to fight. The papal court in Rome received detailed reports about Vlad's techniques through various diplomatic channels, creating a theological crisis about how the church should respond to a ruler who claimed Christian identity while employing methods that seemed to violate every principle of Christian governance. The complexity of this situation was compounded by the practical recognition that condemning Vlad might weaken Christian resistance to Ottoman expansion, potentially resulting in greater suffering for Christian populations under Islamic rule. As Vlad's reputation spread throughout Europe, his methods began influencing other rulers who saw in his techniques potential solutions to their own political challenges. The systematic use of terror as a tool of governance, the careful cultivation of a fearsome reputation, and the strategic application of extreme punishment to prevent larger conflicts all became subjects of study and occasional imitation among princes who faced similar pressures from internal rebellion or foreign invasion. The psychological toll of Vlad's methods extended beyond their immediate victims to encompass the entire population of his realm. Citizens lived in constant awareness that any action might be interpreted as disloyalty, that any word might be reported by informants, and that the protection traditionally offered by social status, religious authority, or foreign citizenship no longer provided meaningful security. This pervasive atmosphere of fear achieved Vlad's political objectives while simultaneously creating a population too traumatized to function normally. The systematic nature of this psychological warfare became evident in how Vlad structured his daily routine around the cultivation of terror. Morning audiences with petitioners were deliberately scheduled to occur within sight and sound of freshly impaled victims from the previous day. Citizens seeking justice or requesting favors were forced to conduct their business while listening to the groans of the dying, creating an atmosphere where even routine governmental functions became exercises in intimidation. Court ceremonies took on theatrical qualities that transformed normal royal protocols into displays of absolute power. Foreign ambassadors arriving for diplomatic negotiations would be escorted through corridors lined with the severed heads of previous envoys who had delivered unwelcome messages. The psychological impact of these arrangements was precisely calculated to undermine the confidence and negotiating position of anyone who dared to challenge Vlad's authority or demands. The prince's personal involvement in these spectacles revealed the extent to which his methods had evolved beyond mere political necessity into something approaching artistic expression. Contemporary accounts describe him dining outdoors among forests of impaled victims, seemingly oblivious to the sounds and smells surrounding him. He would engage in casual conversation while gesturing toward dying prisoners, commenting on their expressions or critiquing the technical aspects of their execution with the detached interest of a connoisseur evaluating fine art. This personal fascination with suffering extended to his treatment of captured enemies, who became subjects for increasingly elaborate experiments in prolonged agony. Ottoman prisoners received particular attention, with Vlad developing specialized techniques designed to maximize both physical pain and symbolic humiliation. Turkish soldiers would be impaled wearing their own turbans and military insignia, transforming symbols of imperial power into grotesque decorations, adorning monuments to their defeat. The creativity applied to these punishments suggests a mind that had moved far beyond conventional strategic thinking into realms of pure psychological innovation. Victims would be positioned to face specific directions, so their final moments would be spent gazing toward their homelands. Stakes would be adjusted to different heights, creating musical effects as wind passed through the dying, turning battlefields into macabre instruments that played symphonies of suffering audible for miles. Religious festivals became opportunities for particularly elaborate displays, with mass executions timed to coincide with Christian holy days. This scheduling served multiple purposes, maximizing the number of witnesses, emphasizing the divine sanction that Vlad claimed for his methods, and creating associations between sacred observances and royal power that reinforced his authority through spiritual as well as temporal fear. The economic implications of these spectacles extended beyond their immediate political impact to reshape the fundamental structure of Wallachian society. Traditional merchant classes, terrified by public executions of traders accused of fraud or tax evasion, began conducting business with a level of scrupulous honesty previously unknown in the region. Markets functioned with mechanical efficiency as participants understood that any dispute or perceived unfairness might result in punishments that bore no relationship to the severity of the offense. Agricultural production increased dramatically as peasants worked with desperate intensity to avoid any appearance of laziness or disloyalty that might attract official attention. Fields were cultivated with unprecedented thoroughness, taxes paid promptly and in full, and village disputes resolved quickly to prevent conflicts that might require princely intervention. The entire realm operated under a form of motivated compliance that achieved administrative efficiency through the simple expedient of making failure absolutely lethal. This transformation of social behavior through systematic terror created what modern observers might recognize as a totalitarian state, where private thoughts and personal relationships became matters of public concern. Citizens learned to monitor their own expressions, moderate their conversations, and report suspicious behavior among neighbors as insurance against accusations of complicity in disloyalty. The traditional bonds of community solidarity dissolved under pressure from survival instincts that prioritized individual safety over collective welfare. The international response to these developments varied dramatically, depending on geographic proximity and political necessity. Neighboring kingdoms watched with fascination and horror as Vlad's methods achieved results that conventional governance had failed to produce. Some rulers quietly envied the absolute control he exercised over his subjects, while others worried about the precedent his techniques might establish for acceptable behavior among Christian princes. Hungarian court records from this period reveal growing unease about their Wallachian ally, whose methods were becoming diplomatically embarrassing, even as they served Hungarian strategic interests by deterring Ottoman expansion. King Matthias Corvinus faced the delicate challenge of maintaining support for a useful buffer state while distancing himself from techniques that violated every principle of chivalric honor and Christian governance. The Holy Roman Empire, with its complex web of competing principalities and religious authorities, struggled to develop coherent policies toward a ruler whose actions defied conventional categorization. Vlad claimed Christian identity and fought against Islamic expansion, which should have made him a natural ally. Yet his methods seemed to violate every principle that distinguished Christian civilization from the barbarism it claimed to oppose. Papal nuncios traveling through Eastern Europe began including detailed reports about Wallachian conditions in their correspondence with Rome, creating a documentary record that reveals the extent to which Vlad's reputation had spread throughout European diplomatic circles. These accounts describe not just individual atrocities, but systematic policies that had transformed an entire realm into what they characterized as a kingdom of the damned. The Ottoman response to these provocations evolved from initial dismissal to growing concern as Vlad's methods began affecting Turkish military morale and recruitment efforts. Stories of captured Ottoman soldiers being impaled in elaborate displays spread throughout the empire, creating reluctance among troops assigned to Wallachian campaigns. Some units reportedly deserted rather than face an enemy whose treatment of prisoners exceeded anything in their military experience. Sultan Mehmed II, whose forces had conquered Constantinople and established Ottoman dominance throughout the eastern Mediterranean, found himself facing an unprecedented challenge from a vassal whose rebellion took forms that conventional military responses seemed inadequate to address. Traditional siege tactics and battlefield maneuvers meant little against an enemy who transformed war itself into psychological theater designed to break morale before combat even began. The Sultan's advisors struggled to develop appropriate countermeasures against techniques that fell outside established military doctrine. How do you maintain discipline among troops who have witnessed their comrades dying in ways that exceed human imagination? How do you sustain offensive operations when supply lines are threatened not just by conventional military action, but by the psychological trauma inflicted on support personnel who encounter the aftermath of Vlad's methods? Intelligence reports reaching the Ottoman court described a transformation in Wallachian warfare that challenged fundamental assumptions about military behavior and political resistance. Traditional concepts of honorable combat, protection for prisoners, and respect for diplomatic immunity had been abandoned in favor of total psychological warfare that recognized no boundaries between combatants and civilians, sacred and secular, or acceptable and unthinkable conduct. The escalating nature of this conflict reflected both rulers' recognition that conventional diplomatic solutions were no longer possible. Vlad had moved beyond the realm of normal political behavior into something that required either complete submission or total destruction. Mehmed had invested too much imperial prestige in Wallachian campaigns to accept the humiliation of withdrawal in the face of a rebellious vassal whose methods mocked Ottoman power. As tensions reached their breaking point in the early 1460s, both sides began preparing for a confrontation that would test the limits of human endurance and military effectiveness. Vlad's innovations in psychological warfare would face their ultimate challenge against the most professional military machine of the age, while Ottoman tactical superiority would confront an enemy who had redefined the very nature of armed resistance. The stage was set for a conflict that would push the boundaries of acceptable conduct far beyond anything previously witnessed in European warfare, where victory would be determined not by superior numbers or better equipment, but by which side could endure the greatest psychological trauma while maintaining the will to continue fighting. The confrontation that erupted in 1462 would become one of history's most psychologically devastating military campaigns. where conventional warfare collided with methods that redefined the very concept of armed resistance. Sultan Mehmed II assembled a massive force of nearly 60,000 troops, supported by the finest artillery of the age, and commanded by generals who had conquered some of Europe's most formidable fortresses. Against this overwhelming military machine stood Vlad with perhaps 10,000 men, inferior equipment, and no hope of victory through conventional tactics. What followed was not a traditional military campaign, but a systematic demonstration of how psychological warfare could neutralize numerical superiority through sheer terror. Vlad's response to the Ottoman invasion transformed his own territory into a weapon more effective than any army, creating conditions so horrific that even seasoned warriors began questioning their commitment to the campaign. The retreating Wallachian forces left behind a landscape that challenged the sanity of those who encountered it. Villages that appeared normal from a distance revealed their true nature only when Ottoman scouts approached closely enough to recognize that the figures they had mistaken for residents were actually impaled corpses positioned to create the illusion of daily life. Wells that should have provided clean water instead contained the decomposing remains of entire families, their bodies arranged to maximize both contamination and psychological impact. Granaries that promised sustenance for advancing troops held only human remains displayed in patterns that suggested ritualistic placement rather than random slaughter. The Ottoman advance slowed dramatically as commanders struggled to maintain discipline among troops who were witnessing horrors that exceeded their previous military experience. Supply lines became unreliable as support personnel refused to venture into Wallachian territory, while recruitment for the campaign grew increasingly difficult as word spread throughout the empire about the nature of warfare in Vlad's domain. The Sultan's professional army, trained to face conventional enemies with predictable tactics, found itself psychologically unprepared for an opponent who had abandoned all accepted rules of military conduct. The most audacious demonstration of Vlad's approach came through a night attack on the Ottoman camp that targeted not military objectives, but the Sultan's personal tent. The raid was never intended to achieve tactical victory through the small force Vlad committed to the assault. Instead, it served as pure psychological theater designed to prove that even the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world remained vulnerable to someone willing to abandon conventional limitations on warfare. The attack failed in its apparent objective of killing or capturing Mehmed II, but succeeded brilliantly in its true purpose of demonstrating that traditional military superiority meant nothing against an enemy who viewed assassination attempts as legitimate diplomatic communication. The message resonated throughout the Ottoman camp with devastating clarity. No rank provided protection, no position offered security, and no conventional military preparation could defend against methods that recognized no boundaries between acceptable and unthinkable conduct. During the retreat from this failed night assault, Vlad's forces captured several hundred Ottoman soldiers who might traditionally have been held for ransom or prisoner exchange. Instead, they were immediately impaled along the road leading back to the main enemy encampment, positioned so their dying cries would be audible to advancing Turkish forces. The psychological impact proved devastating as Ottoman soldiers were forced to march past their own comrades. While listening to pleas for help, they were powerless to provide. Contemporary accounts describe Ottoman units deserting rather than continuing through what they characterized as terrain that belonged more to hell than earth. The professional discipline that had carried Turkish armies across 3 continents began fragmenting under psychological pressures that military training had never anticipated. Officers found themselves commanding troops who had lost confidence in their ability to distinguish between military engagement and supernatural horror. The cumulative effect of these tactics achieved exactly what Vlad had calculated. Despite facing overwhelming numerical disadvantage, his methods slowed the Ottoman advance to a crawl while inflicting psychological casualties that far exceeded physical losses. Supply lines collapsed not through military interdiction, but through the simple refusal of support personnel to operate in conditions that challenged their fundamental assumptions about human behavior and divine justice. Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople through superior tactics and overwhelming force, found himself confronting an enemy whose methods fell entirely outside established military doctrine. Traditional siege techniques meant nothing against a defender who viewed his own territory as expendable resources to be transformed into weapons of psychological warfare. Conventional negotiations were impossible with someone who had demonstrated his contempt for diplomatic immunity through the systematic murder of ambassadors. The turning point came when Ottoman forces encountered a field containing 20,000 impaled prisoners, arranged in concentric circles that created a grotesque amphitheater of dying humanity. These were not random victims, but captured Turkish soldiers and their allies, positioned with mathematical precision to maximize visual impact while ensuring the sounds of their suffering would carry maximum distances. The sight proved so overwhelming that even Sultan Mehmed II, architect of some of history's most ruthless military campaigns, reportedly ordered a retreat rather than advance through what his own chroniclers described as evidence of supernatural evil. This withdrawal by one of Europe's most feared military commanders represented perhaps the greatest triumph of Vlad's methods, proving that reputation alone could achieve victories impossible through conventional military means. The psychological impact rippled throughout the Ottoman Empire as news spread that their invincible sultan had been forced to retreat by an opponent whose army was vastly inferior in every measurable respect, except willingness to embrace methods that exceeded human comprehension. Yet even as Vlad's techniques achieved their immediate strategic objectives, they were simultaneously creating conditions that would ultimately prove self-destructive. The systematic elimination of potential allies through spectacular punishments had isolated him from domestic support networks that might have provided long-term stability. Foreign courts that had initially viewed him as a useful ally began recognizing that his methods made normal diplomatic relationships impossible to maintain. The economic consequences of governing through absolute terror became increasingly apparent as traditional commercial relationships collapsed under the weight of uncertainty about what might constitute punishable offenses. Merchants who had survived Vlad's purges operated with mechanical efficiency born of desperation, but the creative innovation and entrepreneurial risk-taking necessary for genuine economic growth required a level of security that his methods made impossible to achieve. Religious authorities throughout Christian Europe struggled with theological questions raised by a ruler who claimed divine sanction for methods that violated every principle of Christian governance. The papal court received increasingly urgent requests for guidance about how the church should respond to someone whose political identity as a defender of Christendom conflicted absolutely with techniques that seemed to mock Christian teachings about mercy, forgiveness, and human dignity. The international diplomatic community found itself forced to develop entirely new protocols for dealing with a sovereign whose behavior fell outside all established norms of civilized conduct. Traditional concepts of diplomatic immunity, prisoner exchange, and negotiated settlement meant nothing when applied to someone who viewed the murder of envoys as legitimate political communication and considered torture a form of artistic expression worthy of personal involvement and creative refinement. Hungarian court records reveal growing anxiety about maintaining alliance with someone whose methods were becoming diplomatically embarrassing, even as they served Hungarian strategic interests. King Matthias Corvinus faced the impossible challenge of supporting a useful buffer against Ottoman expansion, while distancing himself from techniques that violated every principle of chivalric honor and Christian kingship. The psychological toll on Vlad's own subjects became increasingly evident as the reign progressed into its middle years. Citizens who had initially welcomed strong leadership after decades of civil war found themselves living in constant terror of arbitrary punishment for offenses that might include anything from business disputes to insufficiently enthusiastic displays of loyalty. The social bonds that held communities together dissolved under pressure from survival instincts that prioritized individual safety over collective welfare. The legacy of Vlad the Impaler extends far beyond his death in 1476, transforming from historical reality into something approaching mythology. The prince who had ruled through systematic terror became the inspiration for literature's most famous monster. Yet the fictional Dracula pales in comparison to the calculated brutality of his historical counterpart. While Bram Stoker's vampire inspired fear through supernatural powers, the real Vlad achieved something far more disturbing. He demonstrated that human beings, when unchecked by conscience or consequence, possess capacities for cruelty that exceed any fictional horror. His reign stands as a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not those born of imagination, but those forged by the corruption of power itself.